Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is Scott Bradfield, the master bather, and but you can pronounce it any way you like. And we're here doing a very short one. There goes Lucky. It's not she knows it's not Puppy Noir. She can't hear the Peter Gunn theme song. She's just taken off. She's not interested. She has no interest in anything that's not noir related fiction. And we're going to do a very brief one today. I'm always constantly looking for gimmicky series titles so I don't have to think very much about coming up with titles. And this week I read a book which I kind of was just lying around. I found it. I think I bought it like for 50 cents somewhere because it was a lovely old copy. And I'd always heard good things about a guy named Richard Grant. The book is called Sarabande of Lost Time. And I'd heard good things about him. I was impressed. He's a really, really smart writer. It's not entirely the type of fiction I normally would read, but I liked it. And I thought for a gimmick for the series, it would be, if you liked X, you might really like Y. So that's our new gimmick that no one needs to be bothered by. And mine this week is, if you like Gene Wolfe, whose most famous book is called I think it's called The Book of the New Sun. We'll talk a little bit about him. And if you like him, then you will probably really like this guy. And I'm going to make it even more complicated than that. If you really like Jack Vance, now I really loved Jack Vance when I was a kid, and I still like Jack Vance, then you might also like Richard Grant. And the writer he was most compared to, I was noticing over the years, because I've heard his name around, I knew lots of writers in London, was John Harrison, Mike Harrison, who wrote, his early books were called the Veraconium books. Those are the ones they were kind of spin-offs on sword and sorcery, but they're kind of really complicated Mervyn Peake type narratives, and very haunting and strange books. And this is not one of them. This is one of my favorite of Harrison's books, called The Ice Monkey. I liked his less fantastic story stuff more. But he's often compared to those. So those are four writers that if you like any one of them, you might like another one. So the first one to think about is the Gene Wolfe books, the Book of the New Sun. Gene Wolfe is one of the really interesting writers of the 20th century, 21st century, who I loved his short stories. We talked a bit about him in the Old Orbit books. He wrote some brilliant short stories over his life, lots of really good stories, and some interesting novels, many of them. And he's most famous for The Book of the New Sun. I'll be honest, I've never gotten through the whole Book of the New Sun. I tried it many times. I can tell it's a brilliant book. It's me. It's not quite my sort of thing, but it is brilliant, and I'm going to try to get in the bathtub someday. The idea of the type of science fantasy that Wolfe does, I'm speaking very inexpertly here, is they talk about this kind of super futuristic world. And they have landscapes, and they describe things that are happening that sound, when they're told to you, they're told to you in the language of those people, but you can see underneath that language that there's a sort of technological change in the universe, and there's some far future. That, for example, there's two towers. I think it's two towers outside of town, or on both sides of the town, which you realize after a while are actually old spaceships that have brought people to this planet. And you go into the clock, and you go into these subterranean chambers. The Last Castle has the same sort of feel. I think this is a big influence on Wolfe myself. The Last Castle was a book I read as a kid. I read many Vance books. And they talk about castles and dragons, but they're simply trying to use the language, a language that's familiar to the reader, to describe really impossibly far future landscapes. So you see beneath the language something quite amazing, and you bring a lot of imagination when you read these stories. So I think that Vance is kind of, you can see him coming through Gene Wolfe, and you see it a lot in the Veraconium books of Harrison, and there's a lot of that in Sarabande of Lost Time, which takes place in this far future universe, and for a far future Earth, I guess, where everything's been transformed, and there's great ships passing through the sky, and they're pulling weapons. There's lots of these weapons. They're just described as guns. But they're obviously more than guns. They're some sort of fantastic futuristic device. And one of the things I found interesting about I have to say my feelings for books like these are this is a really, really well written book. He's a really smart narrative writer. There's a lot of characters in it. And like Wolfe could do this too. He really knows how to shift from one scene to another scene well in the future or into another person's point of view, which takes you through these kind of rapidly escalating plot shifts. And I can't really describe it more than that, except that you really have to pay attention. And he's a very narrative writer. So you really feel that you're moving forward in all of his work. I think he's one of the best narrative writers I can remember reading. So I really enjoyed it. My personal feeling is that when I read, I like a lot of fantastic SF and so forth, is that sometimes it's so much in another universe that I kind of lose a little interest after a while. I felt the same way about the Book of the New Sun. I quite like the first book or two, and then I always lose. I just lose a little interest about halfway through this stuff. And I enjoyed reading this all the way through. But it's really, that's why I'm trying to use this as gimmick, is I really liked it. I think it's a really, really powerful piece of prose writing. And I don't know how many more books by Richard Grant I read, but I think he's really worth reading. But if you like Wolfe, you should like Richard Grant. And if you like Jack Vance, you should like them. And then for various reasons, you would probably like Mike M. John Harrison's stuff, his far futuristic sort of stuff that he did with the Viraconian books, or maybe his later or mid-period books, which are a little more realistic and set in more realistic landscapes. And then his later books, which I don't know, which his last few books, which are kind of really far future space opera type things that are very, as anything by Harrison, extremely intelligently produced. So anyway, there's some good writers to try out, particularly if you like this type of stuff. I love The Last Castle, man. I haven't read this in a long time, but I will read this again. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try to get all the way through the Book of the New Sun, because there's a lot of Wolfe books I do like a lot. And if you like those, really dig this out. The Sarabande of Lost Time. This is a real sort of book that shouldn't be lost. This is definitely a work of intelligence and narrative imagination that people need to hold on to. Okay? And we'll talk to you soon. That's our shortest one. No puppies, no Peter Gunn, just a bunch of good writers. Bye.